7 years she was gone, but when the phone finally rang, the first words out of her mouth were, "Only your blood can save him." She was a single mom, vanished without warning. He was a billionaire, living untouchable. But when their worlds collided again, one secret could ruin everything. Let me ask you, if someone who betrayed you, abandoned you, and vanished for years suddenly called, claiming only you could save their child's life, would you pick up? Before we jump in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what kind of story do you crave next? Drop your answer in the comments below. If stories like this grip your heart and refuse to let go, well, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've got another powerful story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now let's get into today's story. The night she vanished, there was no warning, no farewell, not even a hint in her voice that morning when she kissed her little boy on the forehead. What remained was a half-packed bag on the bedroom floor, clothes scattered like pieces of a puzzle no one could finish. A single shoe lay by the window, its partner missing. The curtain fluttered in the night air as though it had watched her step out into the darkness and couldn't stop her. People who saw that room later would argue over what it meant. Some said it looked rushed, as if she'd been pulled away mid-thought. Others whispered it felt staged, like someone wanted the world to believe she left willingly. By dawn, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her child's soft breathing in the next room. Her phone sat on the counter, battery dead, screen cracked. The kind of phone you wouldn't abandon unless you had no choice. Neighbors noticed the police cars that morning, red and blue lights bouncing off the windows, but the officers gave little away. They asked questions, wrote notes, carried boxes of evidence. All that was left for the world outside was a hole shaped like Elena, mother, daughter, friend, gone without explanation. Whispers filled the air quickly. Friends told one another she must have run off, maybe with someone new, maybe with debts she couldn't pay. Others, closer to her, insisted something darker was at work. They remembered the way she checked the locks twice before bed, how her eyes flicked over her shoulder when she walked home late, how her laughter sometimes felt like armor instead of joy. The story twisted depending on who told it. To some, she was a coward who abandoned her responsibilities. To others, she was a victim swallowed by shadows. The police filed their report, but without leads, the case cooled. Life moved on for everyone except those who loved her. A missing person poster taped to a lamppost fades quickly under rain and sun, the ink bleeding until her smile becomes just another ghost on paper. Months turned into years, and her name fell into silence. But silence never means the truth has been buried. Sometimes silence is only the cover for something waiting to be revealed. You see, disappearances are rarely neat. They leave gaps that gnaw at the edges of memory, questions that refuse to settle. Elena's vanishing wasn't an accident. It wasn't even simple escape. What no one saw, what no one could have imagined, was that her absence was part of a bargain. Not the kind written on paper with signatures and witnesses, but the kind carved in fear, the kind made under the weight of threats that choke your breath and force your hand. Bargains where the price is freedom, safety, survival. 7 years. That's how long she remained gone, as if the world had swallowed her whole. 7 birthdays missed, 7 Christmases without a single card, 7 seasons of her child asking questions that no one wanted to answer. People told the boy she was gone, but not gone forever. They said maybe she was searching for herself, maybe she was building a better life. Yet the truth was far more jagged. She hadn't just left. She had been cornered. And every corner she turned only tightened the trap. Then one night, long after the world had stopped asking about her, a phone rang in a mansion high above the city. A man who thought his life was untouchable, his power limitless, pressed the phone to his ear and heard a voice he thought he'd buried with his past. The first thing she said wasn't hello, or I'm alive, or even his name. The first words she breathed, sharp and breaking, were, "Only your blood can save him." Imagine hearing that after 7 years of silence. No explanations. No apologies. Just a demand wrapped in desperation. What kind of story begins that way? And what kind of truth waits at the end of it? Because disappearances, real ones, aren't accidents. They're the smoke left after someone strikes a dangerous bargain, and sooner or later, The fire underneath burns its way into the open. Don't ever call me again. Those were the last words Nathaniel Cross had spoken to Elena before her world unraveled. They weren't said in rage, but with the icy finality of a man used to closing doors and never reopening them. His tone was sharp, clipped, designed to cut. And Elena, with trembling fingers clutching the phone, had swallowed the words like shards of glass, knowing they would never leave her. 7 years passed, and Nathaniel Cross, billionaire industrialist, master of boardrooms and headlines, lived as though he had buried her existence. He was a man who built walls of steel around his life, each success another brick, each scandal deflected with a fortune. Elena's absence wasn't a mystery to him, it was convenient. She had become another ghost tucked behind the curtains of memory, one he refused to acknowledge. But ghosts have a way of returning when the night is darkest. At 2:17 a.m., the mansion was quiet, the kind of quiet money can buy. Thick curtains blocking city noise, security guards pacing at the perimeter, cameras blinking silently in every corner. Nathaniel had been awake, staring at documents spread across his desk, his glass of whiskey untouched. The ring of the phone startled him, not because of the sound, but because of the timing. Calls at that hour rarely carried good news. He picked it up without checking the number, his voice gruff. And then he heard it, her voice. Elena's. Fragile but urgent, breaking yet undeniable. She didn't bother with greetings. She didn't ask how he was. She spoke a single sentence that shredded through every defense he had spent years building. Only your blood can save him. For a moment, Nathaniel couldn't breathe. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only that voice echoing inside him. His mind raced. Who was him? Why now? Why her? Questions collided with memories he thought he had locked away. The nights of bitter silence, the slammed doors, the way she had walked out of his life with nothing but defiance in her eyes. And yet here she was, returning not with explanations, but with a demand. Don't play games with me, he snapped, though his tone betrayed more fear than anger. Silence lingered on the other end. Then came a ragged breath, a whisper wrapped in desperation. This isn't a game, Nathaniel. It's life or death. Those words coiled around him like a trap. Billionaires thrive on control, on dictating the terms of every deal. But this wasn't a deal. It was a plea. And Nathaniel, for the first time in years, felt powerless. He slammed the phone down, but the words wouldn't leave him. Only your blood can save him. They circled his mind like vultures, tearing at the edges of his composure. He poured himself another drink, his hand unsteady. Somewhere out there, Elena was alive. Somewhere out there, she held a secret that could shatter the fortress he had built around his heart. Tell me, if you were Nathaniel, would you ignore the call and let the past stay buried? I want to hear if you'd risk everything or shut the door forever. Her voice cracked through the static, trembling, urgent, every syllable laced with fear. Your blood, it's the only match. Nathaniel froze, gripping the phone as if it might burn him. Those words weren't just strange, they were surgical, cutting straight into his chest, drawing out a truth he didn't want to face. A child's life. That was what this was about. Not business, not revenge, not the tangled bitterness that had separated them years ago. Life or death, for someone small, someone innocent. His pulse pounded in his ears, louder than her breathing on the other end. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, mind clawing for answers. Whose child? He had no children, at least none he acknowledged. He had built his empire precisely to avoid such vulnerabilities, to keep his world transactional, never sentimental. And yet the way Elena spoke, the weight in her tone, it wasn't abstract. This was not a hypothetical cry for help. It was personal. It was urgent. He forced his voice steady. Whose child, Elena? He demanded it like an executive demanding figures from a trembling assistant. But inside, he was unraveling. She didn't answer immediately. The pause was deliberate, or maybe she simply couldn't summon the courage. Then, like a blade pulled slow across skin, she whispered, ours. The word landed heavier than any boardroom betrayal, any market collapse. Ours. His throat went dry. For a moment, he thought she must be lying. It had been years, 7 to be exact, since she walked out, vanishing without explanation. 7 years of silence, absence, whispers that she'd left town, whispers that she'd buried herself in some remote place. But all this time, she hadn't just been gone. She had been raising something, someone. Their child. The whiskey glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor, sharp fragments scattering across the marble. He didn't notice the cut blooming across his palm. All he could hear were echoes, Elena's voice from years ago, begging him not to shut her out, his own voice slamming that door shut, the cruel finality of his words, "Don't ever call me again." And now she had, with the one truth he couldn't ignore. "Where are you?" His voice was hoarse. "Where's the boy?" "A hospital outside the city," she said. "He doesn't have time, Nathaniel. It's rare, his condition. The doctors tested me, everyone else. You're the only match." His chest tightened. He should have felt fury at her deception, at the years stolen from him, at the audacity of this midnight call. But instead, he felt something else creeping in, terror. Terror not for himself, but for a boy he had never met. A boy who might carry his eyes, his stubbornness, his blood. "You should have told me," he said, each word brittle. "I tried," Elena snapped, though her voice trembled beneath the anger. "But you cut me off. You made sure I couldn't." The silence after her words was brutal. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to cling to the image of control he always carried. But he couldn't. Deep down, he knew she was right. His pride had severed more than their marriage. It had severed him from a child he hadn't even known existed. And now that pride threatened to kill the boy before he could even look him in the eye. Nathaniel dragged a hand through his hair, pacing the room as if movement could untangle the knots in his mind. Outside, the city lights blinked like indifferent stars, unaware of the storm tearing through his mansion. Finally, he spoke, steady but low. "I'll come. Text me the address." Elena exhaled, a sound half relief, half grief. Then the line went dead, leaving him alone with the broken glass, the unspoken years, and the crushing weight of fatherhood suddenly placed on his shoulders. Back when she was just Elena, the woman no one noticed, she wasn't chasing money. She was chasing escape. The escape from late rent slips piling on the counter. From the landlord's heavy knock at the door that made her stomach drop. From the endless cycle of waking before sunrise, rushing to one job, sprinting to another, and still falling short at the end of the week. Her life wasn't glamorous, not the kind that turned heads or drew whispers. It was survival stitched together with caffeine, second-hand shoes, and prayers whispered under flickering light bulbs. Yet Elena carried herself like she had more. She had resilience carved into her backbone, even when exhaustion bent her shoulders. She was a single mother already in spirit long before she carried the truth in her belly, because she had always been fighting alone, pushing against a tide that didn't care if she sank. But life has a way of throwing more weight onto the drowning, and one dangerous connection was about to shift her world forever. Nathaniel Cross didn't notice her at first. To him, she was another shadow in the crowd, a waitress balancing plates at his friend's birthday dinner. But he noticed when her laugh cracked through the noise. He noticed when she pushed back, refusing to treat him like the center of the universe. That defiance hooked him. To Elena, he wasn't salvation. He was distraction, a chance to feel something other than exhaustion, even if it was fleeting. She didn't think about the scales between them, his wealth stacked like gold bricks, her life teetering on the edge of eviction. She just wanted to breathe, to taste something that wasn't struggle. But distractions can morph into cages. Their nights blurred into something deeper, until one day the test strip in her bathroom turned positive. She sat on the chipped porcelain edge of the tub, clutching that thin piece of plastic, realizing that the world had just cracked open. She thought of her bills, her small apartment, her 2 jobs, and then she thought of Nathaniel's empire, his mansion, his unshakable confidence. For one fragile heartbeat, she thought maybe this was the answer. Maybe this was the hand of luck finally reaching down to pull her out. Except Nathaniel wasn't built for family. When she told him, she expected resistance. What she didn't expect was dismissal, the cold sharpness of his voice, the refusal to even consider it. That was the night his words carved themselves into her chest. "Don't ever call me again." So she didn't. She vanished. Packed her few belongings, left behind a city that had never felt like home, and disappeared into obscurity. To some, it looked like cowardice. To her, it was survival. She carried not just herself but a heartbeat growing inside her, and she couldn't afford the luxury of Nathaniel's rejection poisoning them both. She worked. God, she worked harder than before. 2 jobs turned into 3. Sleep became a rumor, meals a luxury, but she kept pushing. And when the baby came, when she held him for the first time, none of it mattered. His tiny fist curled around her finger, and suddenly, every debt, every sleepless night, every slammed door became worth it. She wasn't running from life anymore. She was building one, even if it was made of scraps. But shadows don't disappear. Bills kept coming. Jobs vanished. The hospital became her second home when his health began to falter. Doctors whispered words she couldn't afford to hear, rare, complicated, genetic. Each appointment tightened the noose. And through it all she carried a secret, a truth she knew could save him, but at the cost of pride, dignity, and the silence she had sworn to keep. For 7 years, she shielded him from Nathaniel's world, believing she could do it alone. But when the blood tests came back, when the charts glared at her with cruel finality, she knew. There was only one person who could save him. The man she once loved. The man who had cut her out like she was disposable. Now imagine being her. 7 years of grit and sacrifice, only to face the one door you swore you'd never knock on. Would you do it? Would you call the person who shattered you, if it meant saving your child? Tell me in the comments. Nathaniel remembered the last night. Wine spilled across the floor, voices rising until they drowned out reason, a slammed door cutting the air like a blade. He carried that memory like a scar, convinced it was the end of a love affair too fragile to last. In his version of the story, Elena had left him. She had chosen silence over reconciliation, distance over forgiveness. He told himself he was the victim of abandonment, that her vanishing act proved what he'd always feared. People wanted what he could give, but never him. For 7 years, he built his empire higher, a fortress of glass and steel that could shield him from the vulnerability of ever being left again. Every new acquisition, every headline about his fortune became armor. And yet, when the phone rang at 2:17 a.m. and her trembling voice whispered about blood, all of that armor cracked. It wasn't greed that brought her back to him. It wasn't desire. It was desperation. But what gutted him wasn't her plea. It was the realization that she hadn't left for the reasons he told himself. She hadn't vanished because she was selfish or heartless. She'd been running from something else entirely, something he had been blind to while drowning in his own ego. He had thought love had ended. But love was never the battlefield. Survival was. When he arrived at the hospital, the fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. He walked past families huddled in corners, faces drawn tight with worry, and for the first time in years, he felt small. Not the billionaire. Not the untouchable mogul. Just a man who didn't know what waited for him behind a sliding glass door. Elena stood there, thinner than he remembered, her frame worn by years of carrying burdens alone. She wasn't dressed for confrontation. She was dressed for war with life itself. Hair pulled back, clothes practical, eyes sharp but rimmed with exhaustion. She didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't even step closer. She only gestured to the bed. And that's when he saw him. A boy, no more than 6 or 7, lying pale against crisp sheets. Tubes snaked from his arms. Monitors beeped a rhythm that felt both fragile and relentless. His chest rose and fell shallowly, every breath an effort, every second a fight. Nathaniel's world, the one built on numbers and profits and power, collapsed into a pinpoint focus, that child. He froze. The shape of the boy's jaw, the tilt of his chin, it was like staring into a mirror pulled from the past. His throat tightened, and for once, Nathaniel had no words. Elena's voice cut through the silence. He's sick. Your blood is the only match. The room tilted. Nathaniel's memories collided, questions crashing together in his mind. Was this really his son? How many birthdays had passed without him knowing? How many nights had this boy asked questions Elena had to answer alone? He wanted to rage, to demand answers, to pull her apart for keeping something so monumental from him. But the steady beep of the monitor silenced every selfish impulse. This wasn't about him. It was about the boy. Elena's eyes, glassy but unbroken, stayed locked on his. I didn't call for me. I called for him. Whatever anger you have, whatever blame you carry, it can wait. Right now he needs you. Nathaniel's chest heaved as if the air itself had become heavy. He wanted to protest, to remind her of that night, of the wine, of the slammed door. But those memories suddenly felt irrelevant, childish even, compared to the sight of the small, fragile body on the bed. The twist of the knife wasn't Elena's silence all those years. It was the realization that she hadn't run from him. She had run from the crushing weight of survival, from a world that left her to fend for herself with a child who needed more than she could give. And she had chosen silence not to punish him, but to protect herself, to protect the boy. He didn't know if forgiveness could exist between them. He didn't know if trust could ever be rebuilt. But as he stepped closer to the bed, watching the boy's chest rise and fall, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Love had nothing to do with why she disappeared. Survival did. How do you explain a 7-year hole? How do you stitch words together when silence has already carved scars so deep that no language feels strong enough to bridge the gap? Nathaniel sat stiffly in the hospital chair, his eyes fixed on the boy's sleeping face. He wanted to ask everything at once: birthdays, first words, scraped knees, all the milestones that passed him by, but when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. It was Elena who finally broke the silence, her voice steady yet edged with a kind of weariness that only years of loneliness could create. I had to keep him safe, she whispered, almost to herself. And the only way was to disappear. Safe. The word struck him like a slap. Safe from what? From whom? From him? His jaw clenched, and he turned toward her, searching her face for some trace of the woman he remembered. She didn't look away. Her eyes met his, clear and unwavering, though he could see the storm hidden beneath them. You think I left you, she continued, as if reading his thoughts. But I wasn't running from you. I was running from everything tied to you. The deals. The enemies. The shadows that came with your name. You think wealth buys protection, Nathaniel. But it paints a target you can't erase. Her words burned, not because they weren't true, but because they carried pieces of a reality he had never let himself consider. He had lived behind steel gates, guarded by men in suits, certain his empire was a fortress. But Elena had lived outside those walls, and she had seen the cracks. You should have told me, he muttered, voice raw. You should have trusted me. Elena's laugh was low, humorless. Trust? Do you remember the last night? Do you remember what you said? His mind flashed back, the shouting, the accusations, the slammed door. Words he had thought were just heat-of-the-moment daggers suddenly returned with a sharper edge. He had told her never to call him again. He had cut off the very lifeline she now held in her hands. And so I didn't, she said simply. Not until I had no choice. The price of those 7 years weighed heavy between them. Every answer she offered was a stone added to the pile crushing his chest. Yes, the boy was his. Yes, she had carried the burden alone. Yes, she had vanished to keep both of them alive. But each confession carried an unspoken toll: regret, bitterness, rage held back by necessity. He leaned forward, elbows digging into his knees, and whispered more to himself than to her. 7 years. And I didn't even know he existed. Elena's lips tightened, as if the words cut her too. Do you think that was easy for me? Do you think I wanted to see him grow up without knowing his father? Every night, I asked myself if I had made the right choice. Every night, I wished it could have been different. But wishing doesn't keep a child safe. Her voice broke then, the first real crack in her armor, and Nathaniel felt a strange ache ripple through him. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, but the weight of their history kept his hands locked to his lap. The beeping of the monitor filled the silence, a constant reminder that time was not their ally. He looked at the boy again, at the slight twitch of his fingers, at the shallow breaths. And suddenly the debate between them felt almost obscene. What did it matter who was right or wrong when a life hung in the balance? But Elena wasn't finished. She leaned closer, her eyes hard. If you step into his world now, Nathaniel, you don't get to pick and choose. You don't get to play the hero one day and the stranger the next. If you want to be his father, you pay the price. Her words landed like a verdict. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it, let alone live it. To be a father wasn't just about signing papers or donating blood. It was about stepping into 7 years of absence, 7 years of wounds, 7 years of a boy who might never forgive him for not being there. And that was the real question, the one that twisted deeper than any accusation. Did he even deserve the title of father? Now let me ask you, if you were Elena, would you have made the same choice? Would you vanish to protect your child, even if it meant leaving love behind? Tell me in the comments. A neighbor remembered screams, a broken lock, and a shadow slipping into the night. That memory never faded from the street's whispers. Some swore Elena had been running from a man who hurt her. Others claimed she had staged the whole thing, another desperate woman chasing sympathy, maybe even hiding debts. But both versions missed the truth. She wasn't staging a performance, and she wasn't fleeing a single man. She was running from something bigger, heavier, and far more dangerous. Nathaniel only learned this years later, but the seeds were planted that very night. Elena's neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, recalled hearing her front door rattle, then burst open, the splintering wood echoing through the thin walls of the building. She rushed to her window just in time to see a tall figure slip out, head low, moving too quickly for a passerby. Moments later, Elena appeared in the doorway, her hand clutching the frame as if it were the only thing holding her upright. Then she vanished, swallowed by darkness, leaving nothing behind but a half-packed bag and questions that would grow more poisonous with time. The police asked questions. They searched briefly, but never found anything concrete. No forced entry report filed. No fingerprints matched. To them, it looked like a domestic dispute gone quiet. Without bruises, without witnesses willing to testify, the case shrank into whispers. Nathaniel never heard the screams. He was too far away in his glass tower, nursing his pride after their fight, drowning himself in the hollow comfort of expensive liquor. By the time he realized Elena wasn't coming back, she had already crossed into a world where silence meant survival. The truth, her truth, was far more tangled. Elena hadn't run from just one danger. She had stumbled into a debt not measured in dollars, but in power. Someone connected to Nathaniel's world had made her a target. Not because of her choices, but because of his. She was vulnerable, visible, and far easier to break than a billionaire surrounded by walls of lawyers and security. For 7 years, Elena wore that memory like armor. She built her life around it, each move calculated, each friendship cautious, every glance over her shoulder a reminder that the shadow might return. And now, sitting beside Nathaniel in a sterile hospital room, she was being forced to peel back that armor piece by piece. Nathaniel struggled to absorb it. The idea that his fortune, his power, his so-called untouchable empire could ripple outward and ruin lives in ways he never saw, it gnawed at him. He thought money bought insulation. Instead, it painted Elena and their child into the crosshairs of people he never even met. "I thought you were hiding from me," he admitted quietly, his voice low, his eyes still fixed on the boy. Elena shook her head. "You were just the excuse people believed. Nobody asks questions when they think a woman ran from a man. It's easier to swallow than the truth, that she ran because she was hunted." Hunted. The word clung to him like smoke. He looked back at her, really looked, and saw not just the woman who vanished but the survivor who had carried their son through years of shadows. Every memory he had of their fight now felt different. The slammed door wasn't rejection, it was desperation. The silence wasn't cruelty, it was protection. And yet, none of that erased the fact that he had let her go. He had chosen pride over pursuit. But sitting in that chair, with his son's fragile breath filling the room, Nathaniel knew something with sudden, brutal clarity. Running wasn't over. If the shadow had found her once, it could find her again. And this time, it wouldn't just be Elena paying the price. "Meet him," she whispered. "Meet your son." Nathaniel froze. The sterile air of the hospital seemed to thicken, every second stretching long enough to suffocate. His gaze fell on the boy lying beneath white sheets, a small chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm, monitors beeping their cruel reminder of time slipping away. And then he saw it, the unmistakable reflection of himself staring back through the child's eyes. Not just resemblance. A mirror. For a man who spent decades negotiating billion-dollar deals, every nerve sharpened by numbers and contracts, this was the one transaction he couldn't calculate. Blood. His blood. Flowing through a boy he hadn't known existed until that moment. Elena watched him with equal parts hope and dread. She had held this secret close for 7 years, protecting it like a flame in a storm, and now she was asking him to carry it too. Not because she wanted to, because she had no choice. The boy needed him. Not as a name, not as a figure in the headlines, but as flesh and bone. Nathaniel tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. His mind raced back to every cruel dismissal, every night he let anger harden instead of listening. He remembered that last conversation, the bitter edge in his voice when he told her never to call again. And now here he was, summoned in the dead of night because only he could save the life of the child who bore his features. The doctor entered, clipboard in hand, tone clipped and urgent. "We'll need a blood match as soon as possible. It's the only chance." Nathaniel's heartbeat roared in his ears. There it was, no more time to doubt, no more room to escape. A blood test. A simple needle that would decide everything. Not just the boy's survival, but the truth of Nathaniel's denial, his years of absence, his own role in the silence. Elena shifted, her voice brittle but steady. "He deserves the truth. Even if it breaks you." Nathaniel turned sharply toward her, 1,000 accusations on his tongue, but they dissolved before reaching air. What could he say? That she betrayed him? Or that he betrayed himself by refusing to see past his own rage? Either way, the boy in the bed was the answer neither of them could avoid. The nurse entered, preparing the vials, the band around Nathaniel's arm. He barely flinched at the sting of the needle, but inside, the prick burrowed deeper. If the test confirmed what those eyes already screamed, his world would never look the same again. He would no longer be a man defined by profits and empires. He would be a father, with all the weight, responsibility, and guilt that title carried. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred. A faint spark. The possibility that all his hollow years, all the emptiness hidden behind his wealth, might finally mean something. Minutes later, the samples were rushed away, leaving behind silence heavy enough to break glass. Nathaniel sat there, elbows on knees, staring at the floor as though it could reveal his future. Elena leaned back, exhaustion pulling at her features, but her eyes never left him. For the first time in years, there were no barriers between them. Just two people waiting to learn if fate had bound them together more tightly than either had ever imagined. When the results came back, there would be no denying. Numbers didn't lie. And if the test confirmed his blood was the only match, then Nathaniel Cross, untouchable billionaire, self-made king, would be shackled not by contracts, but by love, loss, and the small hand of a boy who had never asked for any of this. If you discovered a child you never knew existed, and their life depended on your blood, would you feel anger, fear, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments. In the hospital, machines beeped in mechanical rhythm, cold and merciless. Doctors whispered in clipped tones at the edge of the room, their words a language of urgency Nathaniel didn't need translated. He could see the truth for himself in the boy's pallor, in the way his small chest strained to rise, in the faint tremble of his lips. Each minute pulled him further from safety, closer to the cliff's edge. Nathaniel's pulse thudded louder than the monitors. His world had been built on control, every decision, every acquisition, every battle fought in boardrooms designed to bend reality to his will. But here, stripped of his armor, he was powerless. No strategy, no wealth, no empire could buy this child another breath. There was only one thing that mattered. And it was the one thing he had never been willing to give. Himself. The doctor turned, voice low but firm. "The match is clear. It has to be you." Those words carried the weight of a gavel striking. Elena's eyes glistened, not with triumph, but with terror. She knew what she was asking. She also knew the cruelty of withholding it. If Nathaniel gave his blood, the boy might live. If he refused, there would be no tomorrow. But beyond the medical charts and the 4 bags, there was something unspoken. A locked door in Nathaniel's soul that she had once tried, and failed, to open. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, the memories clawing at him like ghosts. The last time they spoke, he had made a vow, cruel and final: never again. He meant it then. He believed it. But what vow stands unbroken when a child's life bleeds out in front of you? Elena stepped closer, her voice trembling yet sharp with conviction. "I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for him." She pointed toward the boy's fragile frame, her hand shaking, as though her entire existence was tethered to that small bed. Nathaniel's chest ached, not from fear of the needle or the transfusion, but from the truth unraveling inside him. To give his blood meant admitting that he had been wrong, that his pride had stolen years, that behind every carefully constructed wall was a child who should have been his joy, not his secret. The nurse entered with quiet efficiency, preparing the line, the bags, the equipment. "It has to be now," she urged. Nathaniel stared at the boy, the mirror of his own features, and something inside him broke. All his wealth, all his conquests, felt like ash. What mattered wasn't the skyscrapers with his name etched in glass. It was this boy, this tiny life clinging to the edge, waiting for him to decide whether he was a man or a coward. He extended his arm. His voice cracked, softer than he intended. "Do it." The needle pierced skin, and as his blood flowed into the tube, filling the bag that would soon flow into the child, Nathaniel felt a surge he hadn't expected. Pain, yes, but also release. It was as if 7 years of denial and rage were draining out drop by drop, replaced with something terrifying and yet liberating. Elena covered her mouth, tears sliding unchecked down her face. For years she had pictured this moment in nightmares, wondering if he would choose vengeance over life. Now, watching him sit in silence, tethered to the transfusion, she realized that somewhere beneath the cruelty and absence, there was still a man who could love. The minutes passed like hours. Machines beeped steadily, but with every rise and fall of that tiny chest, Nathaniel leaned forward, willing the boy to fight. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Cross wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about legacy or power or control. He was thinking about a boy he had never met until tonight, a boy who carried his blood and demanded his heart. When the transfusion ended, the nurse carefully disconnected the line. The doctor checked vitals, expression unreadable. Nathaniel braced for words that could crush him or restore him. Elena reached for his hand without hesitation. The doctor finally spoke. "He's stabilizing." Nathaniel exhaled, a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. He didn't even notice the tears streaking down his face until Elena reached up and wiped them gently with her thumb. For the first time in years, he let her. And yet, even with relief washing through him, the truth pressed in. He had opened the door he vowed never to touch. And now there was no closing it again. The room had quieted, but Nathaniel's mind was a storm. Machines hummed with measured precision, the boy's breath steady but shallow. Relief had softened the edges of panic, yet another blade pressed sharper against his thoughts. Was this boy truly his, or was he caught in a net spun from desperation? The DNA results were still somewhere in the pipeline, locked behind processes and laboratories that moved at their own pace. But the boy did not have the luxury of waiting. Nathaniel had hours, maybe less, to make decisions that should have come with years of knowledge, not fragments dropped in the dead of night. Elena stood by the bedside, her face lit faintly by the glow of the monitors. She did not speak, though Nathaniel could feel the weight of her silence pressing against him. She had asked for his blood, and he had given it. But now, questions hung heavier than any transfusion bag. If this was his son, why had she vanished? Why had she left him clawing at shadows, believing betrayal when the truth was something else entirely? And if the boy wasn't his, if this was a cruel twist, a manipulation born of desperation, then what had he just done? His voice cut through the quiet, low but unyielding. "I need to know, Elena. Was it ever me? Or is this another game I wasn't meant to win?" Her shoulders tightened, as though bracing against an unseen wind. She turned slowly, her eyes rimmed red, her mouth trembling. "He's yours." 2 words, fragile as glass yet heavy as chains. They might have been enough if doubt hadn't already embedded itself deep within Nathaniel's chest. He wanted to believe, but years of silence, years of unanswered questions, refused to let him surrender. He leaned forward, his gaze burning into her. Then why hide him? Why vanish for 7 years if you knew this truth could destroy me, or save me? She swallowed, her throat working against tears. Because knowing you would never be enough to protect him. Not from them. Not from the world you built. Not from the world I ran from. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He had heard confessions in boardrooms, betrayals whispered across deals, but nothing cut with the same precision as her words. There was a boy fighting for his life because of decisions made in shadows, and he, Nathaniel Cross, was forced to play savior in a play he had never rehearsed for. The doctor reappeared, voice clipped. He's stable for now, but there's risk. We'll need more transfusions until his system stabilizes fully. He paused, eyes shifting between them. We don't have the DNA confirmation yet. But for now, this is his lifeline. Nathaniel nodded, but inside, the ground split wider. What if the test revealed the boy wasn't his? What if this was a mistake he had no way to undo? He pictured the whispers if the truth surfaced. Billionaire tied to a scandal, manipulated by a woman he once claimed to love, a child who bore his eyes but none of his blood. And yet, when he looked back at that bed, at those eyes flickering open for half a second before exhaustion closed them again, he knew he couldn't walk away. Elena stepped closer, her hand brushing against his sleeve. I didn't bring him here to trap you. I brought him here because I had no other choice. Believe me or don't, but his body believes yours. That's the only proof that matters tonight. Her words settled over him like ash, irritating, choking, yet undeniably true. Science could confirm or deny bloodlines, but the reality was alive in the machines and the transfusion bags. His body had answered for him before his mind could catch up. He exhaled slowly, his chest tightening with an unfamiliar weight. When the results come in, and if you've lied, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The shadow of his anger lingered between them, even as his hand unconsciously brushed the rail of the bed where the boy lay. The nurse entered to adjust the four, her motions brisk. Nathaniel caught sight of the blood bag, faintly warm, carrying pieces of himself into a body that might carry none of his history. He closed his eyes, torn between fury and fragile hope. This wasn't business. This wasn't empire. This was something far messier, something raw, something that terrified him more than losing billions ever could. And as the machines hummed steady, he realized he had hours, not weeks, to decide how far he would let this truth remake him. If you were Nathaniel, standing in that sterile room with only a child's fragile breaths tying you to an uncertain truth, what choice would you make? Would you trust blood, or the woman who once shattered you? Share your thoughts. The envelope was thin, almost too light to hold the weight it carried. But Nathaniel didn't reach for it immediately. He kept his eyes on Elena, watching the way her fingers twisted together, the way her body leaned slightly forward, as if bracing for an impact only she could see. Her past was a ledger written in smudged ink, and he was beginning to realize every entry she had tried to bury was clawing its way back to the surface. The DNA results were still locked away, but other truths bled out first, jagged and unwelcome. Names she had used before Elena. Identities registered in states Nathaniel had never visited. Debts that didn't disappear, only changed hands. And behind every fact she reluctantly admitted was the shadow of someone else, a man she owed, a predator who hadn't forgotten her even after 7 years. She whispered the first name like a confession. Marisol Vega. Nathaniel blinked. He had never heard it before, yet she spoke it with a kind of dread that turned his stomach. That's who I was before you knew me. Before Elena. Before I ran. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. Ran from who? Her lips tightened. From him. From debts I couldn't pay back in cash, debts that turned into threats. He wasn't going to stop at me. And when I found out I was pregnant, I knew staying meant burying both myself and the baby before he ever had a chance to live. The boy stirred faintly on the bed, as if her words drifted across the room and into his shallow breaths. Nathaniel's throat burned. So you left me believing you chose another man over me. You let me drown in that lie. Her eyes glistened. Because if you had known, you would have fought him. And fighting him would have gotten you killed. He didn't just want money, Nathaniel. He wanted control. He wanted me silent, and he would have cut through anyone who stood in his way, including you." Each explanation tasted like poison. It soothed one wound only to open another. If she had been lying all those years for protection, then what else was she still hiding? He wanted to believe her sacrifice was noble, but there was venom in every syllable, an undertow that made him question whether she was saving her child or dragging Nathaniel into ruin alongside her. The doctor entered briefly, laying the envelope with the DNA results on the counter before retreating. Neither reached for it. The silence was thick, their gazes locked like two opponents circling before a fight neither could win. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low. "Tell me everything now. No more half-truths. No more silences. Or I walk out that door, results be damned." Elena closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging. "His name is Victor Hale. He was more than a creditor. He was powerful. He owned people, favors, secrets. I thought if I disappeared, if I kept low, he'd forget me. But debts like mine don't get forgotten. They get inherited. And now," her voice cracked, "now I think he's found us." Nathaniel felt the floor tilt. Victor Hale wasn't just some shadow in Elena's nightmares. He knew the name, whispers from circles where money and fear braided together. A man who had swallowed companies whole, ruined families, vanished enemies without a trace. If Victor had been the phantom chasing her, then Elena's silence wasn't cowardice. It was survival. But still, bile rose in Nathaniel's throat. "And what happens if he knows about me? About this boy?" Her hands shook. "That's why I came to you. Because no matter what I've done, you are the only person with enough power to stand against him." Nathaniel's laugh was bitter, hollow. "So I'm not just a father, you're asking me to be a shield. To fight a war I never agreed to." Her reply was immediate, raw. "I'm asking you to keep him alive. That's all I've ever wanted. That's the only truth that matters." He stared at her, torn between fury and reluctant compassion. Every truth she revealed seemed to poison the next. The names, the debts, the predator circling closer, it all dragged him deeper into her chaos. And yet, lying there was a boy who had his eyes, a boy whose existence tethered Nathaniel to her lies as much as her truths. The envelope sat untouched, its edges curling under the weight of the room's heat. Inside was a fact that could cut the tether forever, or bind it tighter than chains. But Nathaniel hesitated, not because he feared the truth, but because he feared what would follow it. Nathaniel didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, his gaze drifted to Elena, and memory pulled him backward. He saw her not as the fragile figure trembling in a hospital chair, but as she once was, the first time their paths collided. She was balancing trays in a crowded diner, hair tied back loosely, shadows of exhaustion smudged beneath her eyes. Yet even then, there was something different about her. While others smiled because they had to, Elena's smile carried a kind of defiance, as if it refused to be taken away no matter how heavy the world pressed on her shoulders. It wasn't her beauty that struck him, though she had it. It was the way she stood her ground even when life pushed. A rude customer snapping fingers, a manager barking orders, yet she never bent into bitterness. She gave him his coffee with the same steadiness she gave everyone else. He noticed the calluses on her hands, the grit in her laugh, the quick fire that flashed in her eyes when someone tried to dim her light. He hadn't meant to fall then, but he did, not for a face or a figure, but for that fire. And fire can burn, or it can save. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the woman before him. That spark had once lit his world, made him feel alive in ways money and power never could. But now that same spark had scorched everything between them. Her fire, once a beacon, was tangled in lies, debts, and secrets. Still, he couldn't ignore the truth. Fire could destroy, yes, but it could also protect. Perhaps that was what she had been doing all along, shielding their son with flames of silence and sacrifice. "Elena," he said softly, "you should have told me. You should have trusted me." Her lips trembled, her voice breaking through the weight of years. "Trusting you would have meant dragging you into Victor's world. I couldn't. I wouldn't. You had everything to lose, and I had nothing but him." She gestured toward the child lying weak beneath tubes and wires. "I made my choice. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe it cost us everything. But it saved him, until now." The room pulsed with beeping monitors, steady reminders of time slipping away. Nathaniel closed his eyes, replaying their early days. He remembered long nights in tiny apartments where laughter was currency, where hunger was softened by stolen kisses, where dreams were whispered between two people who had nothing but each other. He remembered how alive he had felt, stripped of status, just a man in love with a woman who believed in tomorrow. That memory ached now, because he saw how fragile it had always been. Elena's silence wasn't just betrayal, it was survival. And yet, knowing that didn't lessen the sting of being kept in the dark for 7 years. The envelope sat waiting, silent and heavy with answers. Nathaniel reached for it, his fingers brushing the seal. His heart pounded, not just with fear of what was inside, but with fear of what would happen after. Would confirmation heal something between them, or break it beyond repair? Before he tore it open, he glanced at Elena again. Her eyes begged him for belief, for a flicker of the man who once loved her fire without question. He wondered if that man still existed beneath the scar tissue of anger and time. He slid his thumb under the flap. The paper crinkled, fragile as bone. Inside was the truth they had both been avoiding, a truth that could turn love into fury or fury into reconciliation. He unfolded it slowly, his breath catching. And as the words came into view, his chest tightened. It was undeniable, black ink against white. The child was his. The fire that had once drawn him to Elena surged again, but now it carried something else: responsibility, weight, and a dangerous clarity. Because if Victor Hale wanted leverage, he had just found it. Nathaniel wasn't standing alone anymore. He had a son. And that made him vulnerable in a way money never had. Elena's hand reached for his, hesitant, trembling. He didn't pull away. Not yet. For all the anger that burned inside him, another truth had settled in. A boy's life wasn't a bargaining chip, it was a reason to fight. Would you have forgiven her at this moment, knowing she'd lied but also knowing her lies had been the only shield keeping your child alive? Comment below. I want to know how you'd see it. The DNA envelope lay on the table, heavy as stone, though the truth was already inked in Nathaniel's chest. His hand trembled over it, the weight of 1,000 possibilities pressing down on his shoulders. The sterile hospital light flickered above, buzzing faintly, as though mocking the silence between him and Elena. He didn't need to open the envelope anymore. Deep inside, he already knew. The boy hooked up to tubes and wires was his blood, his legacy, his most fragile truth. And yet, the paper remained. Because sometimes it isn't knowledge that breaks you, it's the moment you admit it out loud. Elena's voice cut through the static of his thoughts, fragile but steady. He's yours. The words hung there, suspended in the air, impossible to ignore. He had braced himself for them, repeated them silently in his mind, but hearing them spoken aloud was like a blade pressed against his chest. He stared at her, at the mother of his child, at the woman who had vanished 7 long years ago and dragged his soul into silence. She looked smaller now, almost broken, but her eyes carried that same defiance he had fallen for years ago. A spark that could burn or heal. Nathaniel forced himself to breathe, though every inhale felt like swallowing glass. "You should have told me," he muttered, not as an accusation, but as a plea. His voice cracked on the edges. "I couldn't," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Victor would have destroyed him, and you." That name twisted in his chest like rusted metal. Victor Hale. A man whose shadow stretched over every deal, every whispered threat in the city. Nathaniel had spent years avoiding entanglement with him, knowing one wrong move meant ruin. And now Elena had tethered his entire existence to Victor's game without his consent. The boy's monitor beeped rhythmically, each sound reminding Nathaniel that time was bleeding out. Choices had to be made. But how could he choose when every path led to fire? "Elena," he said slowly, his jaw tight, "if Victor finds out he's mine." "He already knows," she interrupted, her voice trembling with a weight heavier than guilt. The words hit like a strike to the chest. Nathaniel's knuckles whitened against the edge of the bed. She wasn't just confessing lineage, She was confessing danger. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. The envelope, the child, Elena herself, all of it was bait in Victor's snare. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, steadying the fury building beneath his ribs. He thought of the empire he had built, of the walls of glass and steel surrounding him, of the cold boardrooms where his word was law. None of it mattered now. A boy's fragile pulse was his new empire, and Elena's whispered "he's yours" had rewritten the foundation of his entire life. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him, pleading, terrified, hopeful. And though rage pressed against his chest, another emotion surfaced. Responsibility. The kind that couldn't be outsourced or bought. Nathaniel reached across the bed, brushing his fingers against the boy's small hand. The child stirred faintly, his tiny grip tightening around Nathaniel's finger as though instinctively recognizing something deeper than memory. That single touch shattered the last of his resistance. "Yes," Nathaniel whispered, not just to Elena but to himself, to the universe, to the boy who had unknowingly waited 7 years for this moment. "He's mine." And with those 3 words, his life split in 2. The man who once believed wealth made him untouchable had died in that sterile room. What remained was a father, unprepared, furious, but bound by blood and the fire of a son's fragile heartbeat. The envelope sat unopened on the table. It didn't matter anymore. Some truths don't need paper. They burn into flesh, into soul, undeniable and permanent. Now Nathaniel understood something he had never admitted before. Victor Hale wasn't after money or revenge. He was after leverage. And there was no greater leverage than a child. The monitor beeped again, steady yet fragile, a countdown hidden in plain sound. Nathaniel knew what had to be done. He would bleed for this boy if it came to that. But bleeding was the easy part. Protecting him from Victor, that would take everything. So he looked at Elena, his eyes burning with a mixture of fury and devotion. "If he's mine," he said slowly, "then so is this fight. And I don't lose." The boy was his blood. His son. The truth sat heavy in Nathaniel's chest, not like a secret anymore, but like a vow sealed in fire. He had spoken the words, claimed his child, and in doing so, he had opened a door that could never be closed again. Father. It wasn't a title he had ever imagined carrying, yet now it burned into him with such ferocity he almost couldn't breathe. But the moment was fragile, fleeting, and it shattered under the weight of reality. Because the danger that had driven Elena into shadows for 7 long years had not dissolved with confession. It had simply followed her, waiting for its chance to strike. And now Nathaniel could feel it, creeping through the sterile air of the hospital, pressing against the glass, waiting at the edge of the night. The beep of machines carried on, steady but fragile, almost mocking in their rhythm. Elena sat rigid, her hands clutching the armrest as if bracing for impact. She didn't need to say the words. Nathaniel already understood. Victor knew. He had always known. And the moment Nathaniel bled into his son's veins, the moment he tethered himself irrevocably to that fragile life, Victor would own the leash. Then came the sound, a heavy thud echoing down the hallway. Too sharp, too intentional to be mistaken for the shuffle of a nurse. Nathaniel's head snapped toward the door. Elena's breath hitched, her knuckles whitening. And then, faint but unmistakable, the squeak of polished shoes against linoleum. Not hurried, not hesitant. Calm. Predatory. Nathaniel's pulse quickened, but his face hardened into the steel mask he had worn in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. That mask had won him empires. Tonight, it would have to protect his son. The door handle twitched. Once. Twice. Then stilled. The silence was louder than any alarm. Nathaniel rose slowly from his chair, his shadow stretching across the boy's bed. He positioned himself between the child and the door, every muscle taut with fury and fear. He was unarmed, unprepared, but he was not powerless. Not anymore. Elena's whisper trembled through the air. "He's here." The name wasn't spoken, but it didn't have to be. Nathaniel felt it. The weight of Victor Hale's presence pressing through the thin barrier of wood and steel. The man had haunted their lives for years, a wolf prowling outside the fragile sanctuary Elena had built in her absence. And now, he had come to claim what he believed was his. The handle turned again, slow this time, deliberate. Nathaniel braced himself, heart pounding. His empire had been built on contracts and power plays, but this was primal. The instinct of a father. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel realized money could not shield him. It could not buy him out of this moment. Only will, only blood, only the fire that now consumed his chest would decide what happened next. The door didn't open. Instead, a slip of paper slid beneath it. White, folded, edges crisp. Nathaniel's eyes locked on it, his breath shallow. Elena's lips parted in horror, recognition flashing across her face. She knew before he bent to pick it up. The note was simple. One line, written in Victor's neat, controlled hand, "He belongs to me." Nathaniel's grip tightened on the paper until it crumpled in his fist. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. Victor wasn't here to storm in with violence. Not yet. He was here to remind them that the game had already begun, that the hospital walls couldn't keep him out, that every step Nathaniel took now was under his gaze. Elena buried her face in her hands, a broken sob escaping her throat. Nathaniel turned, his eyes falling on the boy's pale face, on the tubes and wires that kept him tethered to life. That fragile heartbeat was both a miracle and a weapon. And Nathaniel knew exactly what Victor intended, to force him to trade power for protection, wealth for silence, freedom for chains. But Nathaniel Cross had built an empire out of surviving wolves. And if Victor thought he would hand over his son, he was gravely mistaken. For the first time in years, Nathaniel didn't just want to win, he needed to. The envelope of DNA still sat unopened on the table, forgotten now, irrelevant. The boy was his blood, his son. And the man at the door, the predator waiting in silence, was already planning how to use that truth against them. Nathaniel squared his shoulders, the paper still crushed in his fist. "He belongs to me," he muttered under his breath, rewriting Victor's words into a vow. Because in that moment, he understood, this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about war. "Now tell me, if someone slid a note under your door claiming your child as theirs, what would you do? Would you run, or would you fight until your last breath?" Share your answer in the comments. The war announced itself not with declarations but with footsteps, the scrape of boots echoing in the sterile corridors of the hospital. Nathaniel didn't need to look to know the sound didn't belong to doctors or nurses. It was too heavy, too synchronized. Elena's hand flew to her mouth, her trembling frame betraying the terror she'd been living with for years. And then, the unmistakable click of metal safeties being flipped off. Armed men. Not whispers of threats anymore, but steel and flesh and bone, debts collected in the currency of fear. The door rattled once, harder this time, and then burst open. 3 men in black suits filled the doorway, the kind of presence that silenced air itself. Their eyes were dead, but their weapons were not. Nathaniel shifted instinctively, placing himself squarely in front of the hospital bed where his son lay. His voice was calm, almost too calm when he spoke. "You're making a mistake." One of the men smirked, a cruel twist of lips that carried no humor. "The mistake," he replied, "was thinking you could keep what belongs to someone else." His eyes flicked toward the boy, and Nathaniel felt rage burn hotter than anything he had ever known. Elena stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Please don't. He's just a child." "Quiet." The command snapped like a whip, silencing her. Nathaniel's mind raced. Money had always been his shield, his answer to every problem. But here, in this room where his son's life was tethered to machines, there was no check large enough, no deal smooth enough to erase the barrel of a gun aimed at the most fragile part of his world. To protect the boy, Nathaniel would have to risk everything. Not just his wealth, not just his reputation, but the empire he had built brick by ruthless brick. And empires don't survive gunfire. The leader of the intruders stepped closer, lowering his weapon but not his menace. "Victor wants assurance. He wants control. You give us that boy, and we walk away tonight." The words seared through the air like poison. Nathaniel's body went rigid. Give them the boy. The thought alone clawed at his chest. No empire, no amount of power, could ever be worth the cost of surrendering blood. He took a step forward, closing the space, forcing his eyes into the man's. "Tell Victor this," Nathaniel hissed. If he wants control, he'll have to kill me first. And even then, he won't win. The gun twitched, just enough to raise the stakes. Elena gasped, a sharp sound that sliced the silence. The boy stirred weakly, his monitor spiking, as if even in his half-conscious state he could feel the war unfolding around him. Time slowed. Nathaniel felt the weight of every choice he'd made in life press against him, crushing in its enormity. He had clawed his way up from nothing, turned enemies into allies, bent governments to his will. But none of it mattered now. What mattered was the frail chest rising and falling behind him, the proof of life he would not allow anyone to steal. And then came the voice, colder than steel, from behind the suited men. Enough. Victor stepped into the room, his presence darker than the shadows that clung to him. He wasn't armed, because he didn't need to be. His weapon was control, always had been. His eyes lingered on Nathaniel, then drifted to the child. A smile curved his lips, chilling in its confidence. You always were stubborn, Cross, Victor said smoothly. But stubbornness won't stop bullets. Nathaniel's jaw clenched, his fists curling. This was the moment, the pivot of everything. He could fight and risk the empire, risk his legacy, perhaps even risk his own life. Or he could yield, hand over what Victor demanded, and live in chains. But Nathaniel Cross wasn't born to yield. You touch him, Nathaniel growled, and I'll burn everything you've ever built to the ground. The room pulsed with silence, thick, suffocating. Guns raised slightly, Elena's tears fell unchecked, the boy's weak breath filled the space. And for the first time, Nathaniel felt alive, not as a billionaire, not as a mogul, but as a father prepared to wage war. Morning did not bring peace. It brought headlines. Screens across the city lit up with words Nathaniel wished he could erase. Billionaire's secret family exposed. 7 years of lies uncovered. Cross empire in crisis. Reporters shouted questions at every corner of his buildings. Cameras flashed. Microphones shoved toward tinted windows. The world smelled blood, and the scent was intoxicating. His empire, so carefully guarded, so meticulously crafted, was cracking under the weight of scandal. Yet none of that compared to the silence inside the small kitchen where 3 people sat at a table that wasn't his. A chipped ceramic bowl of fruit in the center, wallpaper peeling at the corners, an old clock ticking far too loudly. Elena sat rigid, eyes locked on the wood grain, her hands clasped so tightly they shook. The boy leaned against her, still fragile, but awake now, staring curiously at the man across from him. And Nathaniel, who had built towers out of nothing, who had spoken in boardrooms with presidents and kings, had no words. What happens now? Elena whispered finally, her voice thin, raw, almost lost beneath the clock's tick. The question hung there, heavier than any headline, sharper than any bullet. Nathaniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because truthfully, he didn't know. He had spent his life making decisions without hesitation, every move calculated, every outcome controlled. But here, in this moment, he was stripped of every strategy. All he had was a son he didn't know, a woman who had vanished from him. And the crushing knowledge that the world would never see them as simply a family. The boy fidgeted, tugging gently at the sleeve of Nathaniel's shirt. Are you my dad? His voice was timid, searching for something more than blood, something beyond biology. Nathaniel's throat tightened. He wanted to say yes, to give the boy certainty, but what did yes mean? Yes, I'm your father, but I wasn't there for 7 years. Yes, I'm your father, but the world will now dissect your existence like gossip. Yes, I'm your father, but I don't even know what kind of man you think I am. Yes, Nathaniel said finally, the word falling heavy between them. Elena's eyes flicked to him then, and for the first time since she called him, there was no anger in them, only exhaustion, only fear. They won't stop, she said softly. Victor's men, the press, the vultures. We're not safe here. We're not safe anywhere. Nathaniel leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. He had fought off rivals, dismantled corporations, outmaneuvered governments. But how do you fight shadows that lurk in headlines and hallways? How do you protect something so fragile when the entire world is trying to pry it apart? He glanced at the boy again, and a thought struck him with brutal clarity. It doesn't matter if I lose everything else. I cannot lose him. The weight of that realization shifted something inside him. For the first time, Nathaniel understood what power truly meant. Not the kind that came from money or control, but the kind that came from sacrifice, the willingness to bleed for someone else. The clock ticked again. Elena's gaze held his. So what's your answer, Nathaniel? Do we run, or do we fight? He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand across his face. The empire could crumble, the world could curse his name, but there was no world at all if he couldn't protect his son. We fight, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was final. We fight, and this time, we don't stop until it ends. The boy blinked, looking between them, sensing the weight of words he didn't fully understand. He reached for Nathaniel's hand, small fingers curling around his own. Nathaniel froze, then closed his hand around the boy's. And in that small act, something shifted again, not just resolve but belonging. But outside that tiny kitchen, storms were gathering. Reporters circled like wolves. Victor's shadow stretched longer, darker. Enemies were no longer hiding in back alleys. They were in boardrooms, in government offices, in every place Nathaniel once thought untouchable. The war was far from over. And in many ways, it was just beginning. If the world suddenly knew your most fragile secret, would you protect it at all costs, or surrender it to survive? Comment below. I want to know what you'd do in Nathaniel's place. Power can silence critics. It can buy headlines, erase scandals, even bend laws. But what Nathaniel discovered in that cramped kitchen was a truth money could never alter. Blood ties don't dissolve in boardrooms, and they don't shrink beneath headlines. They bind tighter in fire, and when tested, they reveal who you are when everything else burns away. For Elena, that lesson was sharper. She had spent years believing her most defining moment was the night she vanished, leaving nothing but a half-packed bag and whispers behind. But as she sat watching Nathaniel's hand wrapped around their son's, she realized her real turning point wasn't escape. It was return. Every mile she ran, every false name, every shadow she hid under, all of it had been building to this, the moment she chose to walk back into danger, back into his life, because her child's survival depended on it. And in that choice, she reclaimed not just her son's future, but her own. Nathaniel moved differently in the days that followed. Once, he had thrived on control, measuring victories in contracts and stock prices. Now his victories were measured in quieter ways. A steady heartbeat on a monitor, the boy's laughter echoing in a sterile hospital corridor, Elena finally allowing herself to lean against him without flinching. The empire still trembled under scandal, but for the first time, Nathaniel didn't care about skyscrapers or headlines. His fight wasn't for an empire anymore. It was for a family. The media storm didn't vanish overnight. Reporters hounded, investors panicked, enemies circled. But Nathaniel met each challenge with a new clarity. When rivals tried to exploit the chaos, he didn't just defend his holdings, he dismantled theirs. When Victor's threats lingered in the shadows, Nathaniel dragged them into the light, exposing debts, crimes, networks. Piece by piece, he turned the war into something Victor couldn't win, not because Nathaniel had deeper pockets, but because he had something to lose that made him relentless. And through it all, the boy healed. Slowly at first, pale and quiet, then stronger, braver. One afternoon, in a sunlit room filled with flowers sent by strangers who had read the headlines and felt something deeper than gossip, the boy reached out to Nathaniel and whispered a single word that silenced every fear Nathaniel had carried: Dad. It wasn't about DNA results, or whispered judgments, or debts collected in the night. That word was a bridge, unshakable, built on something beyond blood. It was built on choice. The choice Nathaniel made to step into a role he had once feared, and the choice the boy made to believe him. Elena watched, tears threatening but never falling, because for the first time in years, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't defined by her mistakes or her debts. She was defined by the courage to come back, to face every shadow with her son in her arms. And that courage was mirrored now in Nathaniel's eyes, a reflection she hadn't thought she'd ever see again. In the end, the empire did survive, not untouched, not flawless, but different. Stronger because it wasn't built on walls anymore, but on something rawer, something harder to destroy: truth. Nathaniel stood before cameras once, not as a mogul defending his reputation, but as a father admitting to the world that family isn't weakness. It's the one thing worth surrendering everything else for. Elena's 5-second moment was never the night she disappeared. It was the morning she returned and placed her son's life in the hands of the man she once left. That was her fire, her turning point, the moment secrets lost their power. Because sometimes, the only thing stronger than what we hide is what we choose to hold on to. And Nathaniel's? It wasn't the blood test, or the fight in that hospital corridor, or the scandal that shook his empire. It was the instant his son's hand slipped into his, small and fragile, and he knew without question that he would burn every last skyscraper to the ground if it meant keeping that hand safe. Because in the end, family isn't about perfection, or clean histories, or untouched reputations. It's about who stays when the world tries to tear you apart. It's about who you choose to fight for. And for Nathaniel and Elena, it wasn't about a vanished past or a broken empire. It was about a future built not on power, not on secrets, but on something stronger than both.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, the next one will hit even deeper. It's more gripping, more unexpected, and waiting for you right now. Don't hesitate. Click the video on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.